How is the invasion proceeding that was started yesterday by Russian volunteers fighting on the Ukrainian side? How many tanks can Russia produce per month at this very moment? How many personnel can the Ukrainian side still recruit out of their available manpower? We'll answer these questions, and we'll talk about the developments along the front line, as well as international aid, political connections, political events, etc. in this situation report. We'll start off with an overall information about the airstrikes. We have Ukrainian side has done a number of airstrikes in the last 2 days, hitting various Russian refineries all over the country. So far, I have confirmation about hits in Oriol, Nizhny Novgorod, and Ryazan. Here we see, for instance, one that is being filmed just passing by in the background, and we see the refinery building and see it slowly going down. Here, then you can see the strike. Smoke cloud. These Ukrainian side is now striking the Russian oil infrastructure. There are also reports about strikes in fuel storages, and the news now is that Russia stopped exporting any fuel products, showing that they actually have problems with their refinery capacity as the Ukrainian drones hit a lot of them, which are in the western part of Russia and thus in the range of Ukrainian drones. At the same time, we have some more, I would not say information, it's more rumors about the events, the past events of the last 24 to 48 hours. Now, in yesterday's short video, I showed you that a Russian Ilyushin 76 was crashed inside of Russia with supposedly 15 personnel on board. The Russians said it was a bird strike, and the distance was far too far away from the front line for it to be a Ukrainian air defense system, at least one that wouldn't be shoulder fired and operated from inside of Russia. Now there are claims that supposedly it had the crew of an A-50 on board and was meant to deliver it to an airport where there are spare A-50s. That doesn't seem to be true, though, because not only did the plane crash right after the start, the other thing would be it seems fairly unlikely that those A-50s are ready for takeoff if they have been stored in the open for months and years. So I would not say that this is believable. It seems more like some rumors that are being spread because people hope that this is the case. The same is coming what we have about the drone strikes that happened yesterday. One of them hit Taganrog again, where the Beriev factory is that did build the A-50 and that does modernize them. And there's also the claim that an A-50 burned down there as well. Now, both of it is possible. But I have not seen anything close to a proof in either regard. So as of now, I would categorize those two claims more as wishful thinking than as any proof that this was actually what happened. Now let's go to the developments along the northern front line. We have at various points, you can see them here, where Russian volunteers fighting on the Ukrainian side. Here is the third one. Here, and here. There were rumors about 2 other locations where the fighting has also happened. Now, the attack was done by the Russian Volunteer Corps, RDK, the Freedom of Russia Legion, the LSR, and the Siberian Battalion. Now, fighting was supposed to be on Russian ground, but we see that at least some pictures that were spread, we see one here, where the claim was that this was in Russia. It was geolocalized by Ukrainians, mentioned, on the Ukrainian side. So while we do know they have crossed the border, for instance, there's a video of them losing a T-64 BV right after crossing the border, unfortunately to a mine, and then the Russians drop a hand grenade into open hatches of the turret and it blows up. So while we do know that they did cross the border, it's not even clear that they are still on the Russian soil. But even if they were, obviously this would be a propaganda move We cannot expect them to seriously hold any territory here. It's likely that they managed initially to push in somewhat, as the Russians were guarding this mostly with conscripts that are not mentally prepared for fighting and that have limited training probably and no combat experience. So that they might have initial successes here is likely, but as said, this is a propaganda move. This is not a way to liberate Russia, as they claim that they would be able to hold out there is out of the question. So let's switch over to the eastern front line, and here we have a Russian success close to Terny. It has been geolocalized, and you can see it's fairly close to Terny already. And if we zoom in, it should have been ready here, I think. So they have advanced closer to Terny. There were some Russian claims that they have captured Terny. I do not see any proof of it, but we do see that they have come closer, and obviously Terny is important for the whole ground lines of communication along the Shere beds, which is right west of the town. Then we have developments south of the Seversky Donetsk, because I cannot see any change in the Serebryansk forest or in the direction of Kupiansk. So we switch over to the front line south of it, and there we see that the Russians have probably gained some additional ground in Ivanivske. Now there's a fresh geolocalization up here and right here. Those are here and more or less here. So we see this is tiny. This is tens of meters at most. Even from the Russian side, I see confirmation from Russian mill bloggers that the Ukrainians are still in Ivanivske. So while there have been claims for a couple of days now that the Russians captured Ivanivske, as of now, the Ukrainians definitely still hold out in the western part, at least at that point where I finished researching for this video. On the as further south here, Klishivka, Andrivka, etc., I do not see any change. We have some developments again at the area of Avdivka. Here at Orlivka, up here, we have a small Russian advance. We see it in the western part of Orlivka, and you can see that this road is turning to the right here. Here. On this part here, where you can see where it opens up like a V. So the Russians have reached this point. They are getting closer to the water here, but again, the advance has been roughly 100 to 150 meters in this area. Also, they have had some success at Pervomaiske. I have confirmation from Ukrainian side that they roughly lost this area here, more or less this, roughly in a depth of 500 meters and a width of 500 meters as well. So more or less this area east of this here is lost to the Ukrainians over the past few days. At Nevelske, the Russians have also managed to succeed. They managed to gain a foothold in this windbreaker tree line here, right east of Nevelske. The town itself is still under Ukraine, although we have a geolocalization of it as well here, where we see that the Russians were spotted in this tree line, which so far was not under Russian control. Further south in the area of Marinka, again, fresh Russian successes, direction of Herohivka, and here it was actually not that small advance that they managed to. We see it's at the end of the second waterway. They managed to get the tree line here, which would be up here. So this whole area has likely already fallen to the Russians at this very moment. They keep pushing towards Herohivka and manage to advance along the water, along those ponds here. They managed to advance further west. Further south of it, at Pobieda, the Russians managed to advance somewhat northwest of the town of Pobieda. We have a geolocalization here where they are spotted right in that windbreaker here. Yeah. So likely this one has now fallen into Russian hands as well. In the overall situation regarding Novomikhailivka, nothing has changed. And in Novomikhailivka, I do not see any change. We have some another small Russian advance here in the area of Shevchenko, which is southwest of Vulika. Here the Russians managed to advance quite a bit actually. It's this tree line here. We see the road going down here. This road. It's west of that road. So where where it's crossing before it's turning over. So the Russians have reached that point here, advancing somewhat, roughly a kilometer to the northwest of Shevchenko. At the oblast border, or no longer really in the oblast border, this is Velika Novosilka. Here in this area, I do not have any change, but we have a change in this area here, Malinivka. Here we have a Russian advance bit that was filmed. Malinivka, you see it here, and water here. See on this bit here, roughly, Russians have advanced by probably another kilometer to the front. They were attacked there, and they seem to have been here. So it's unclear whether they managed to gain a foothold, but we see that they are in this direction, where we haven't recently seen fresh Russian attacks, at least in this axis. So far, everything has been more or less stable. South of Orikhiv, I do not see any change that I can record. The same is about the Dnipro, so we can stop talking about the front line at this very moment. If we take the overall situation in last situation report, I showed you a video, and the details were, according to the Russians, they destroyed air defense systems. There's some rumoring and some talks, some of it probably wishful thinking, that it actually wasn't a Patriot system. Initially, it was misidentified by the Russian as an S-300, but it seems to have been a Patriot system. And by now, there is, in Ukrainian social media, they mourn the loss of a comrade, of a soldier who was a part of a Patriot unit and has died just at the time where the Russians published those videos, which seems to be another indication that at least one Patriot TEL transporter erector launcher has been destroyed by the Russians. So from what I see, I would say it's almost certain that the videos we saw was actually the destruction of, at the very least, one TEL of the Patriot system that was delivered by Germany. Also, the spokesperson of the Tavrisk group, which is more or less the southeastern area of the front line, said the Russians continue using. I'm sorry, I just got a phone call. So the Tavrisk group says the Russians keep using chemical weapons. In fact, now, while we at the first glance might think about mustard gas or something like this, they actually only, in quotation mark, use tear gas. But according to the Chemical Weapons Convention, tear gas is also forbidden. So the Russians break the Chemical Weapons Convention if they use those tear gases. In the past, we have seen visual evidence. Obviously, now, if they say they have used 60 grenades on our front line, we don't have visual evidence every single time of it. But at least to a certain degree, it is proven that Russia has used chemical weapons in this war, even though they are not purely deadly, but more riot control units. But then again, if the gas is heavier than the air, then it sinks down into trenches, which might force the Ukrainian soldiers to leave it, thus become victims. And if they don't leave it, it might compete with oxygen and thus kill them through that. That's why it's classified as a chemical weapon as well. Then we have some pictures about fortification work. They are actually somewhat interesting. Now, we see the works here. This is supposedly close to Kharkiv. We see lines of dragon teeth in front. We see fortifications having lanes here. Some of it in the windbreaker, some of it behind. We see that they built shelters in it as well. And we have, from different angles here, are fortified points. Obviously, some bunkers that are meant to withstand heavier hits with firing position. Here we see heavy weaponry, heavy equipment being used by this. So we see Ukrainians increasing their work on building fortifications now, as it was desperately needed. We have other pictures here. This shows us the dragon teeth that are being set up, and you can see it has barbed wire in between. So far, we haven't seen that much barbed wire in usage, but now we see that the other pictures showing the positions they are building. From what I've seen, this is concrete, and it's then being reinforced with wood and earth on top. And this should be at least the design. Yeah, it's the design. That fortification, I don't think it's the same, because background, you can clearly see that those pillars here are meant to be the same. So this is obviously meant to be actually a firing position that is fortified in here with a small slit, whether it's for a machine gun, whether it's just for observation or for an guided missile, I cannot say. Obviously, an ATGM would need something to take the backblast that it can be fired in here, but as I said, this is a chimney, so it's meant to be able to, I guess at least that's a chimney, so it's meant to it as well to increase the crew comfort and thus the availability and the readiness forces here as well. There's another video as well, I can speed it up for us, where you can see the Ukrainians building those. You see the strength of walls, equipment that is being used in regards to defensive works. We see that was probably one of those firing positions. Well, some of you might have a better knowledge about construction and thus can just quantify how much, how well those are built and what damage they can take. Fortunately, this is not. Then we have news from the Black Sea. The Ukrainians have opened a grain corridor on their own by pushing the Russian Black Sea's fleet away from their coast. Over 1,000 ships have now used this Ukrainian grain corridor. Over 30 million tons of freight has been exported. Then we have the information from the Ukrainian side that they say they found roughly 1,600 civilians north of Kiev that were killed during the Russian invasion. Another sign how bloody it has been on the civilians and why the Ukrainian side didn't want to continue negotiations that would might lead to a peace agreement, but one that would leave Ukraine completely defenseless towards Russia. We talked about this here on this channel in the past. Then we have a Telegram article. Now this is by Konstantin Mashovets. He is a lieutenant colonel in the Ukrainian armed forces, from what I found, and I mentioned a couple of times in the past. Also being referenced by a lot of international observers, think tanks, etc., be it in Poland, be it in the United States. And he's talking here. So while I have no clue about how much he's on point, how well informed he is, I can at least see that I know that he's Ukrainian, pro-Ukrainian, and that he's being referenced by a lot of serious think tanks, so he should probably be considered what he's saying. Now, I took he has a longer list of longer article about the current situation. I just take one of them here. We take two interesting informations out of it. First of all, he claims that a lot of the units are now at 30%, where the level of equipment, of arms and military equipment at 30% of the requirement is already considered high. So he says that Russian units side of Ukraine, at least a lot of them, supposedly have a equipment level lower than 30% of what they are supposed to have. Now, this is makes somewhat sense, as the Russians suffer tremendous losses in the last 2 years, and even their official data, if we take the Russians by their word, what they have produced in the meantime can't keep up with us. So that the strength of their forces has to be reduced by now, especially as they increase the size of their forces while not being able to keep up with the production of the necessary weapons. That seems to make somewhat sense. Obviously, the quick question is how much is it on the Ukrainian side, and it's probably not dramatically better, especially regarding the size, how much the Ukrainian forces have grown in the same time as well. And as again, we see the Russian usage of heavy weaponry, but we see a lot of infantry heavy attacks in the past, and that would be an explanation for this. While at the same time, while only 30% might sound great for the Ukrainian side, obviously the question is also in relative terms, does that mean the Ukrainians are stronger than the Russians by now? And I do not see any serious analysts claiming that this is the case. This just shows that the Russians can't keep up with their demand, and that's not much of a surprise. But what he has here is another different point, and he mentions here, but if you at your best, you don't produce more than 350 to 400 tanks a year. Now, if we look at the past data, roughly half a year ago, the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, said that the Russians produce roughly 20, maybe a little more a month. this cannot mean that he claims that they only produce up to 400 a year, including the reactivation of past tanks. So this would mean up from 20. It's now at 30 or a little bit over 30 new tanks being produced each month, likely T90M and T80BVM in the Ober 2022 version. This means that the Russians might have increased their output of new tanks by another 50%, up to 30 or a little bit over this in the past. But at the same time, while this is great news for Russia, it's clear that the losses are still much higher than the fresh production. And another interesting part is that the amount of modern tanks that are supposedly being built, even where the Ukrainian side is agreeing that they are being built, the majority doesn't really appear on the front line. If we look at losses that can be observed, most of it is old equipment right now. The more modern tanks don't seem to be used, which allows for the expectation that is being spread around in pro-Ukrainian circles right now, that the Russians might build a dedicated strike force out of reserves, out of freshly created units that is supposed to go into maneuver warfare in the summer of this year. Whether or not this is true is obviously far from certain. We'll have to observe it, but at least it shows the opportunity. If we can right now see T-55s, T-62s, and older T-72 versions along the front line, but barely any 80 BVM is being destroyed, barely any 90M is being destroyed, despite the Ukrainians claiming that they produce 20 to 30 a month, and they are missing. Where are they? So that might be that this will cause another problem for the Ukrainians in the future if the Russians are actually building up an attack force that is supposed to go through their lines later this summer. At the same time, we have to say that Russia is likely, probably in addition to those freshly produced tanks, they are reactivating roughly 100 additional tanks a month. The good news for Ukraine there is that the speed of the reactivations will likely stagnate or go down. Stagnate or go down because every tank that was easy to reactivate will have been pulled out first. So from now on, every tank is in a worse shape and will need more work. At the same time, obviously, the production of spare parts, the experience of the workers is increasing and is getting more efficient. So that might be able to keep up somewhat with the reactivation, but overall, we should not expect a massive growth. Overall, though, according to different analysis, whether it's the RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, whether it's the Wall Street Journal or open source analysis, the Russians will likely be able to have additional equipment in their stock for another 2 to 5 years. So it's far from over that the Russians will be able to create fresh troops out of fresh material out of their stockpiles without their new production. At the same time, though, there are claims that Russian defense industry has severe worker shortages right now, and there's a tool shortage as well in the defense industry. Whether that's true, to which degree this will be an influence of, unfortunately, again, is not my field of expertise, so I can only report to you what I read. I cannot say much more about that. At the same time, though, we do have the information that shipment of equipment from North Korea by ship has been resumed. There was the report that there was no more ships going between Russia and North Korea. At the same time, obviously, they have a train connection, so resupply was able to be shipped by train at the same time, but now there's visual evidence of ships being back on the route there. And bad news for Ukraine, there's a video of 3 of their Mi-8 likely being refueled. That seems to be a fuel truck, and it's being hit with a cluster munition over it. The video is then continuing and showing strikes on 2 of those helicopters that are being destroyed with guided munitions. All of this was geolocalized here. Now this is, as you can see, west of Donetsk. Hoplophile, able to find it. So this was, again, roughly, let's 40 to 50 kilometers from the front line. The Ukrainians obviously wanted to refuel there, maybe rearm to strike back, and they have been observed with a drone and then being hit, probably by Tornado S system. with at least with the second strike, and it seems to be clear now that the Ukrainians at the very least lost 2 Mi-8 transport helicopters. The claims are that they also lost 2 of the pilots KIA in this attack. In the political sphere, we have something from a Russian ally. Pashinyan, the Armenian prime minister, said that he now considers leaving the CSTO if it's not going to define clearly when and under which circumstances they're going to help Armenia under a foreign aggression. At this moment, Azerbaijani soldiers are standing in Armenian territory, and we are not talking about the disputed territories here. Like, for instance, you have Armenian territory on the Azerbaijani side of the border somewhere here, and some the other way around in this area. Obviously, this is still occupied by the respective country, but there are Azerbaijani soldiers on the border here on the Armenian side since September 2023 at the very least, and the CSTO has done nothing. Russia has not helped them, despite basically Armenia being invaded. Armenia asked for Article 4, which is the more or less equivalent to Article 5 of the NATO, and the CSTO has let them down, as obviously CSTO is Russia, and Russia is not able to help Armenia against an Azerbaijani invasion. Now Pashinyan is considering officially leaving the CSTO should it not define when it's going to help Armenia if it's being invaded. Bloomberg News is saying that the Kremlin is now thinking about raising taxes, another sign that the war cost is getting home. According to Bloomberg, it's going to be considered after the presidential election, and this would be a sign that the war costs are now causing a strain on the Russian war coffers. Troop generation, we have an article here on the in the Financial Times. It mentions the problems with recruitment and how many personnel is available, and I thought that graphics was quite nice to see. Now, according to them, 1.2 are already serving. In the occupied territory, they lost 2.9 million men that are basically no longer available. 1.3 million are living abroad. Critical workers, defense industry, etc. are 0.6, and disabled, not fit for military service are another 1.5 million. And they have they come to the conclusion that in total 3.7 million men are available for additional recruitment by the Ukrainian government. Obviously, the issue here is dissent in the country if all of them are being recruited, and the even bigger issue is how to finance them, as they might be paying taxes right now. As soon as they are in the armed forces, they won't anymore, and Ukraine has to somehow plug the gaps in its budget. And according to international media reports, and we'll talk about the international aid. According to media reports, Germany is currently negotiating with India to buy artillery ammunition. This was mentioned by German media. I'm not completely sure how much of this is likely, whether it's going to lead to it. We talked about this extensively in the past, that India has, I think, over 70% of its big equipment is coming from Russia, so it can't really afford too much to annoy Russia to keep its Air Force in the air, to keep its tanks rolling. They will have issues with the spare parts if they annoy Russia too much, but at least German media claims that Germany is currently negotiating with India to buy artillery shells from them. The British government is allotting 125 million pounds to buy 10,000 drones for the Ukrainians. Canada is saying that the missing money from the US, because the Republican Speaker of the House is prolonging the decision about the Ukraine aid. This missing money is postponing NASAMS delivery for the air defense system NASAMS. Then we have information that 6 F-16s will be available for Ukraine in summer, together with 12 pilots. So this summer, supposedly 6 of them will be combat ready and 12 pilots will have finished their training. Then the United States have created a new package of 300 million in aid, mostly artillery shells, but some anti-tank weapons and other equipment as well. According to the government, the money was created cost-saving measures without going too much into detail, that somehow they negotiated contracts which allowed for some budgetary leeway, and it would be enough ammunition and artillery shells for a few weeks. That's the quote. At the same time, the 4 billion presidential drawdown authority is still available and is still not being touched by Biden. And I said, like I said it enough in the past, Biden has not even come close to giving Ukraine what he would have been legally possible, what would have been legally possible for him. But at the same time, we see Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House in the US, currently simply postponing the vote that is likely going to give Ukraine extra money. He's simply postponing it for whatever reason. Personally, I have to admit, I don't really understand it anymore, why he would do this, unless, of course, you assume that he's actually in Russia's pocket, because the political debate about it over by now. I'm not completely sure. But that's not my problem either. And finally, we have Ukrainian media saying that the Czech government has found another 200 shells that will be available for Ukraine. So I guess through some defense industry contacts, they were able to gain contact to other customers. That's the likely source of it, that we're able to part with willing to part with another 200,000 shells. So the Ukrainian shell hunger should be, at least for the time being, more or less over in the really near future, which is good news. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'm sorry for the references to the US government. In Germany, I see a lot of propaganda in German media about the current dispute in the Congress, and I see Biden having failed a lot in aiding Ukraine, but current actions from the Republican government, from the Republican House, are not fully understandable to me either. So I think it's both of them are, at least to a certain degree, maybe not the same way, but both of them are to blame. Yeah, I'm sorry for getting involved into this if I annoy my American viewers. Still, if you still liked it, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment. What do you think about the stuff I said today? We shed some light for the other readers, how you see the situation in the US Congress. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel. And this channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means of the description. That's it for me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.